Howdy folks, so this is part 4 of our Gameolgy series on the survival horror genre. Be sure you check out parts 1, 2, and 3 before you check out this part. So in our last section of Gameology, we talked a little bit about, how one actually achieves horror in a video game. More specifically, how you put fear into the player. And what I said in that video was the best thing to do is to start from the setting and go from there. Because when you're making a survival horror game, the story really is in the setting, in the environmental storytelling. So if you can nail that, find a creative way to, sort of guide players through this deadly location, in addition to just getting the little details apart to, put fear into them, you're basically set, because everything else, the enemies, the ambience, stuff like that, it'll all come as part of that. So that's how I feel you create horror in a video game. So before we move on to inventory management or resource management, I thought we'd go over some pitfalls that one should avoid when it comes to, making a horror game. How you can make something, not scary in an effort to scare players. So the first thing is pretty obvious: when the setting itself is neglected. If you don't have an interesting setting, odds are you're probably not going to make a terribly scary or frightening game. A good example that I always point to in this issue is the first Dino Crisis. In the last video, I said that the basic story of Resident Evil is, you go to a mansion, it's crawling with zombies, and you need to find a way to escape. However, if you've played Resident Evil, you know there's a lot more to it than that. There's a really deep, interesting, and complex story to the Spencer Mansion. But the story of Dino Crisis, it really just boils down to a group of military officers going to an island, a lab, and finding it's crawling with dinosaurs. And as to why the dinosaurs are there and all that stuff, there's not really much of a story there when you actually do learn why the dinosaurs are there in the first place. It's honestly kind of lame. Now, that's not to say that Dino Crisis isn't a series that can't be scary. The main reason Dino Crisis works as a horror game is really just because of insurmountable the enemy, the threat at hand is. People often say that Dino Crisis is just Resident Evil with dinosaurs. However, it's a lot more complex than that. It's not like the zombies are just replaced with dinosaurs and then they just behave in the same way the zombies do. The dinosaurs are much more dangerous than the zombies are. They're faster, they're smarter, they're tougher. It gets to the point where you just want to outright avoid them rather than directly face them, which a lot of people would say is the point with the zombies too. But, the zombies are slow, they're stupid, it's a lot easier to dodge them. And it's kind of fun to shoot the zombies. You can blow their heads off. So that's why Dino Crisis works, but that's probably why Dino Crisis didn't become, a long-running horror franchise like Resident Evil was. It's mostly because there just wasn't much of a story to tell there to begin with. One of the things with a horror game is that if you were to make a sequel, you have to figure out a way to scare players twice, and you've pretty much shown your entire hand with the first Dino Crisis. So there isn't a whole lot to add there. It's probably why for the sequel they just decided to make a straight up action game. So because of that, another thing you want to avoid when you're making a horror game is not relying too much on the threat at hand. A good example of that would be Clock Tower. Now, Clock Tower is not a survival horror game. While it definitely has its horror in spades, it doesn't have resource management, and it of course doesn't have combats. The whole premise of this game is that you're the victim, you're not the hero. But as I said, I'm not a huge fan of that type of horror game. And Clock Tower is both a good and bad example of that type of horror game. For starters, as I said, the main thing you're facing in Clock Tower is the Scissor Man. He's basically the boogeyman, you know, your Jason Voorhees, this unkillable enemy that, you know, if it catches you, you're basically dead. And initially, that is pretty scary. The first couple of times you encounter Scissor Man, it actually is genuinely frightening. However, as you play Clock Tower, you start to get used to Scissor Man's presence. You'll start to figure out where he spawns from, and like you can use the same method to get away from him every time and it'll work. But that never becomes a huge issue for Clock Tower because Scissor Man isn't the only thing to worry about in the mansion that you're in. There are other threats in the mansion that you will encounter from time to time. They're not as frequent as Scissor Man, of course. He's the main thing you're dealing with. But there is still a disturbing quality to the setting, as well as the people who live there. You just get the sense that something really bad has been going on here. Scissor Man is not the reason Clock Tower is scary. He's only a small part of why it's scary, which ends up becoming a big problem in the sequel when they take Scissor Man out of the mansion and just put him in some random nondescript town. Now, mechanically, I would say that Clock Tower 2 is superior to the SNES game, but at the same time, I would say it's less effective as a horror game because after playing through that first game, you're kind of used to dealing with Scissor Man at this point, and now that he's out of that setting that really made the horror of Clock Tower, he just kind of becomes your stock standard slasher villain. He just becomes infinitely less effective. Now, that's not to say you can't make a survival horror game where there's only one unkillable enemy to deal with. A really good recent example would actually be Amnesia the Bunker. However, there are a lot of reasons this works here, but it doesn't work in other games. For starters, Amnesia is a survival horror game. It's got combat, it's got resource management, and it is a very scary game. But it also only has one monster to deal with, so your means of defense, you don't have any way to actually kill the monster, and that's the point. Your weapons will, of course, be able to fend it off, but you only have so many ways to fend it off, so that's where the horror of Amnesia comes from, and that's why it gets away with just having that one unkillable monster. The other thing that makes Amnesia the Bunker work is that it is a much shorter game than something like Clock Tower 2. The original Clock Tower was also pretty short as well, but the second game, it can be a little lengthy, especially considering how many times you have to replay it in order to get all the endings. That's why Amnesia the Bunker did so well. Yeah, you only have one monster, but it ends before you get used to the monster's presence. It's not like it ever loses its luster. And really, that's another thing that horror games really need to be careful of. They really shouldn't drag on for too long, and really, this is a bigger problem with a lot of modern games in general. A lot of the time, especially with prices getting as big as they are, people want as much content as they can get, and a lot of developers have taken to stretching out the playtime as much as they could, you know, artificially lengthening things. And that is sort of becoming a problem, and that is especially poison in a horror game, because if it goes on for too long, you're going to get used to the threat at hand, and it's going to stop becoming scary. A good example is Dead Space. The opening hours of Dead Space are great. Yes, you're just being introduced to the setting, the necromorphs, all that stuff. It is very frightening, and it continues to be frightening because they're constantly introducing new necromorphs. Stuff is always going wrong on the ship. You realize that there are survivors who are doing some really messed up and stupid things, and it just never loses its luster. Until you get to the final section of the game. By this point, you've seen everything the game has to offer, and now you're just kind of going through the motions. It's not really doing anything else to surprise you anymore, and that ends up becoming a big issue. Like, Dead Space, unfortunately, goes on just a little bit too long, so repetition sets in, and when repetition sets in, then you've essentially lost the horror of the game. And that continues into the follow-up with Dead Space 2, which tries to maintain that horror atmosphere that the original game had going for it, and also introducing new variants of the necromorphs to keep players guessing. But unfortunately, by this point, the series just isn't really capable of being scary anymore. And because, again, you're just used to the necromorphs, and it never introduces anything particularly new to really surprise players. Now, it's not to say that Dead Space 2 can't be a really fun game, but the joy of playing it comes more from the fact that it's just a really fun action game. It's not really a particularly effective horror game anymore. Really, sequels in general are something that's either going to make or break a horror franchise. And the reason for that, as I said, sequels are just really hard to do with the horror genre, because even with a horror movie or a horror book, you rely on certain tricks or stuff like that to scare the audience, and horror games are no different. So if you're making a horror game, one of the biggest challenges you're going to face is, how do you scare someone again? Something like Dead Space 2, it relies on a lot of the same tricks that the first game did, and as a result, it's just not as effective. And just, there are plenty of sequels to horror video games that I can think of that have that issue. Dead Space 2, The Suffering, The Ties That Bind, even some of the Silent Hill games fall victim to this as well. Even Resident Evil, at times, has this issue. For example, Resident Evil 2 is a great remake. For starters, you're playing as different characters, so, while if you played the first game, you have an idea of what's happening in Raccoon City, but there's still a lot of questions, what the deal with the zombies is, but why the hell are they running rampant in the city? So that is a big question. It raises the stakes of the game, and because you're playing as new characters, you learn about it as they would. It also helps that, Resident Evil 2 is constantly surprising players with new and interesting quirks. For example, rather than the zombies being a big deal, one of the first major enemies you encounter are the lickers, which are infinitely creepier. And then there's the setting of the game. Going back to setting, again, the most important thing to consider when you're making a horror video game. The setting of the Raccoon City Police Department. The idea of playing through a horror game in a police precinct might not sound all that scary, because you would think that you would be safe within a police station during a zombie apocalypse. However, that's part of why the setting works so well, because this is a place that you think would be safe in this type of situation, but then you get to the station only to find that it's already been compromised. All those people who were there to protect you have already fallen victim to the zombie plague, so, and even worse, more of the zombies are seeping in. So it ends up becoming even more effective, I would argue, than the first game, especially considering that your way out is actually into the Umbrella Lab that just happens to be located nearby. So yeah, if you can come up with a creative way to follow up the first game, you'll probably do well with the horror sequel. But given how self-contained a lot of horror games are, a sequel is going to be very hard to do. Resident Evil is really the only game I can think of where they've had such a steady line of sequels, and not everyone has been good. I'm not a big fan of Resident Evil 3's scenario, because, you don't feel as vulnerable as you do in Resident Evil 2, even with Nemesis stomping after you. Isn't that funny? But Code Veronica, being trapped on the island, which, is full of all kinds of psychopaths related to the Umbrella Corporation, that's when the Umbrella Corporation really starts to get unnerving. Resident Evil 4, while it is batshit insane, the locale is unique and interesting. It's something different. And then Resident Evil 7. a very interesting setting and brings it right back to the horror roots of the game. So yeah, be careful with sequels, that's all I can say. And the last one, and this is probably the one I'm sure a lot of people are waiting for me to bring up. For the love of FN Lifeson, do not rely on jump scares. Now, that's not to say that jump scares can't be used right in a horror game. Something like Five Nights at Freddy's, it's mostly remembered as a, jump scare of the game. But the funny thing about Five Nights at Freddy's is that, it's not like it's constant jump scares. The jump scares are more of a punishment for failing at what the game asks you to do. So because of that, it makes you a little more anxious as you're playing the game, trying to manage your power, all that stuff. But then you're hearing the sounds of the animatronics, and sometimes you'll see them outside the security room. That's when Five Nights at Freddy's is at its best. The jump scares are just, the fail states. But in general, jump scares are something you really want to avoid in a horror game because it's not valid fear that you put in the player. It's just a response to surprise. It's not the pleasant kind of surprise either, which is why people get so annoyed with it. I'd much rather have a lot of slow build-up with a monster, emerging out of the shadows. I take a few shots at it, realize they can't do anything, and then I need to book it. That's the kind of scares that you want to put in a horror game. So yeah, don't go overboard with the jump scares. They can be done occasionally, but not all the time. I actually have a good example of a jump scare done right. Take a look at this. So I remember playing Dead Space for the first time and jumping at that because it's just so surprising. You had never seen anything like this at this point. And while this does happen a few times throughout the Dead Space, it's only like maybe 2-3 times it happens. And every time it does make you jump, but more importantly, every time you go into a long hallway, it makes you a little bit nervous because you never know if this tentacle is going to pop out and try to eat you or whatever is going on here. So yeah, that's an example of a jump scare being done right. You can maybe have 1, 2, maybe 3 throughout the entire experience, or in the case of Five Nights at Freddy's, where you wouldn't get any jump scares if you were playing the game right. But if you are using jump scares in order to get fear across in a video game, then I hate to tell you this, but you are actively failing at being a horror game. That's just a fact of the matter. But anyway, that's all the pitfalls you need to avoid when you're making a horror game. Just lean on the setting, really think about the details of it, and everything will fall into place. Now we're finished talking about horror. Let's get into the survival aspect of survival horror with resource management. So tune in next time for that, guys.